Hello, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David. Since the pandemic hit and made touring and performing impossible, I've taken to broadcasting interviews with people who I can't visit in person anymore. They're live streamed most weekdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cable Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon. All these interviews also then go out in podcast form afterwards, which you can find if you look up This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform, or just go to davidrovix.com. Today, we're spending the hour with artist, organizer, and academic Dr. Graciela Monteagudo. Graciela is a lecturer in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Massachusetts, and she's been involved in various capacities with social movements around the world, particularly in Argentina, where she's from, and the U.S., where she's lived for many decades now. Graciela, great to have you here on my little show.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start with just talking about what it's been like since the pandemic hit, trying to teach at the university? And did it just shut down? Or you were mentioning that hundreds of people have been laid off? And
Not at the part. I'm part of UMass Amherst, and UMass has a different sites. So 400 faculty were laid off at the beginning of the pandemic from UMass Dartmouth. UMass Amherst, we have a better union, I think, and they've been able to negotiate so that we are working for free during the summer. We are off contract normally during the summer, but this summer we have to work to transform all the courses so that we can teach them remote. But I think the shocking thing was in March, when from one day to the next we found out that no more classes in person. So at the same time, people started freaking out about the economy and a number of things. So it really felt like the end of the world. That week was, borderline the end of the world, and you wanted to have everybody close and take care of them.
right.
But
Yeah.
we did it, and I think the students got something out of it. The students were very, very helpful and understanding with the faculty, which wasn't something I was expecting. I was
Right.
expecting like more
Interesting.
angst, and I'm not getting what I paid for. But every email that I got, the students would start, "I hope you're well and safe. We understand that this is a terrible time for you and for us." So it was
Wow.
doable, but it was a huge stress on the faculty, and we were not compensated for it, nor will
Right.
we.
Right. And also in terms of the technology, were the students more like they became instructors in a way, I imagine.
Well, you gotta think that I've been teaching online for many years. Apart from face to face, I also do a side job where I teach online. But
Ah,
there are professors that have been teaching at the university since they were 30, and it's a research university. So the pressure is not so much on teaching, but on doing research. So many of them had never touched, an online course. So I think for them it was more interesting than for me.
I'll bet it was just horrible for them. Huh? But having visited one of your classes once, the whole environment was so high tech. I mean,
I
all the
know.
students had a laptop, so it's a whole different situation, I guess, than
Oh,
for
well, we
many.
changed. I changed from one day to the next. I decided that that was not going to be possible. We had to drop the team-based learning component of that class that you saw. Students sit in groups, and I just do a very short lecture, and then they need to research on their own and present their findings on screens and stuff. All of that was gone. I just recorded the lectures, and I open up several hours a week for face-to-face discussions, and I made the final so that nobody would fail it.
Right? Yeah. Um, Graciela, I was reading something you wrote in Jacobin magazine, or I guess whatever they call it these days, online or offline, whatever. But it's Jacobin anyway, and last year, and you accurately predicted the results of the coming Argentinian presidential election in the article, which apparently wasn't that hard to do. I guess everybody knew he was going to win. But it's been like, I mean, I wanted to ask you some things about what's going on now, but I think I find it's hard to really talk about anything in 2020 without at first talking about 2019 at least. And like Argentina was $50 billion in debt to the IMF, and it just like I guess I've lost track of a lot of things that were going on in Argentina, as I'm sure many other people did. It kind of comes in and out of your consciousness, and the movement that was going on there 19 years ago is amazing. And then to hear like that the country is $50 billion in debt to the IMF, and that was yeah, I know it's a huge question asking you to little catch us up on the past 19 years in Argentina. But I mean, how did that happen? It was can you sum it up?
The way that so Argentina went in 2001, and I think that's something that most people heard about. Went into this economic crisis in 2001 as a result of following very closely the economic plans of the IMF. So once we went for many years doing exactly what they told us, the country collapsed, which was something that I also predicted along with many other people 20 years before that happened. As soon as we got the plans of the IMF, it was clear that this was a plan to extract money out of our economy and that there was nothing in it to support the growth of the economy. On the contrary, the plan was very clearly designed so that we would lose our capacity to produce industrial products on our own. We would lose our capacity to develop our own vaccines and our own medicines and a number of other things. So there were a fringe number of people who understood this, and we did a lot of activism at the time, but it was useless. And the several governments that came after the dictatorship, they continued to indebt themselves to the IMF. So in 2001, the economy completely collapsed. From one day to the next, there was nothing there. The banks closed down. They kept people's monies, your savings, your checking accounts, all that money was gone. The money you deposited in dollars, they transform it into pesos, and they slash the currency by, I don't know, 200% or something. So it was just a complete crash, and people strengthened their mutual aid stuff and survived through that. They took over factories. They created popular soup kitchens, and they engage in brutal warfare without guns with the state to get supplies to be able to survive that time. So out of all of that, what happened was that the Peronist Party, the group that still follows, and it's mostly what dominates Argentinian popular politics, the Peronists, they were in a brutal crisis and they couldn't accommodate themselves. That's why the left grew a lot at that point, the radical left and the anti-capitalist left, and all these actions happened. But in 2003, the Peronists rearranged their stuff, and they lost the election, but the other one was such a horrible candidate that he withdrew, and this guy came to power. So that was Nestor Kirchner. So Kirchner gets on power at a moment where people are ready to do anything. And they've done a lot of stuff. And what he does is, from the state, he sort of rearranges the economy so that these sectors that were combative sectors that had their own economic income from their productive projects and stuff, they become part of the state. He co-opts those enterprises, and he asks the middle class to calm down and let the unemployed workers continue with the road blockades, because in 2 years he will have it under control. And he did. And he did, without too much repression. There was some repression, but not excessive. He was able to control all these movements, incorporated most of the organizers into the government, with salaries and power and stuff. And in 2 years, the situation was under control. And he did something really, really good, which was to break up with the IMF. So he offered a sum of money to the IMF and the debtors, the international debtors, and they said yes, because Argentina was in such a condition that they wouldn't have been able to get anything out of us anyway. So at that point, he broke up with the IMF and he designed a plan to restructure the national economy. The dude didn't read Trotsky. He didn't know this was not possible, and he tried. And he got a lot of support to do that, a lot of support, and the whole country really was behind them. But at the same time he did this, he tried to, instead of, I don't know if he would have been able to do something different, but the way that they raise funds to keep all the poor people fed was by taxing the soybeans. Argentina has become, the whole country is now planted with soybeans. And at that time, it was an enormous amount of money that came into the country by selling these GMO soybeans all over the world, especially to China. So at some point, something similar to what happened in Venezuela happened in Argentina, that the commodity prices of the soy fell. And when that happened, they started putting a lot of taxes on the middle classes. And stupidly, they did a number of things that got the middle classes, the upper middle classes, to bond with the owners of the land, with the financiers in Argentina, with the worst possible, most regressive political entities. So when they lost this financial support, international support, and when they lost, which they never had much, the middle classes, the government collapsed, and we went back to a neoliberal government under Macri. So the first thing Macri did was undo all those progressive stuff that they had been able to reach with the IMF. And he went back into debt with the IMF, huge amount of debt, huge. And he took away all the taxes of these high earning financiers and landowners. So clearly, if you take away all the taxes, the only thing you can do is bring money from outside. And that's what he did. And of course, that works for a couple of years because they give you a couple of years since you have to start paying.
Right. So they can call you an economic miracle in the meantime.
Yeah. And then 2 years later, you didn't do the right thing. And when the country collapses again, it's your fault. But for a couple of years, things worked out, and he had popular support from the middle classes and the upper middle classes. But at the end of that 4-year period, as he famously said, things happened.
Things happened.
This was in a public interview. It was the funniest thing. People said to him, the journalist says to him, listen, your government was going so well. The economy was booming. How come? And he said, well, things happened.
Yeah, you're supposed to have a little better analysis when you're the president.
And things are going to happen to a country, especially in Argentina. But he wasn't prepared for those things, and the economy continued to collapse. People became very angsty because the industries were closing down, the economy was crashing, and there was nothing that he would do to support that. So at that point, Cristina Kirchner, who was Nestor Kirchner's wife from the previous government and the president of the country for 8 years, she rearranged her political persona, and instead of trying to run herself, she had a more conservative Peronist run as the president, and she would run as the vice president.
Why?
So why? Because she was extremely, she had lost a lot of prestige at the end of the second government. She had lost a lot of prestige at the end of the first government also, when she was a little clumsy, and she sort of created a way of taxing the landowners that didn't separate the small landowners from the big ones. So when she did that, the lower middle classes immediately went for the small landowners, and the whole thing went against her. But Nestor Kirchner died very soon after she came into power the first time, and she managed that very well. She was, the widow-in-law, the widow for everybody. She was like a Jackie Kennedy in a way.
Right. But also a really savvy political operative as well.
Oh, yeah. She was the president. At this point, she was the president of the country, and she had been a senator for many years. They come from the left of the Peronist government. They were supporters of armed struggle in the 70s, for example. So, these are people who know how to do stuff. So she handled that death extremely well, and all the popularity that she lost, she regained it. But by the end of that cycle, the economy was not good, and she's a woman who doesn't she doesn't, do the woman thing. She's not humble. She doesn't ask for forgiveness every time she thinks something. So that, combined with an economy that wasn't quite right, huge taxes, and the perception that the middle classes always have that poor people don't want to work and they're living off the taxes that we pay, that totally undid her, and she was hated, not by her supporters. When she left, there was a protest in support of her. She was escorted back home by masses of people, but she was escorted back home. So she was very smart in that second time, because the first time she promoted a candidate that wasn't very popular and nobody wanted to vote for him. But the second time she got this guy who had been her political opponent, but was considered like a good administrator. So when she steps down and allows him to go first, they win, but not by a landslide, as I thought. When I saw the results of this first primaries, I thought he would win by a landslide. It wasn't the case. Macri retained a ton of power. And now with the pandemic, you can tell that power is still there. Fernandez is not Kirchner. He's very careful. He's not, advancing with all the force that we would expect him to advance against the right wing. And he's making a lot of concessions. But at the same time, things are really complicated because theoretically they are anti-punitivists. They don't think that you solve issues that have economic causes by sending people to jail. So when the pandemic started, the jails, I should have said that Fernandez came into power 100 days before COVID-19 hit.
He comes to power 100 days before COVID-19, and he's also inheriting a $50 billion IMF debt that his government wasn't necessarily responsible for.
Everything that you want to say against him, you have to take into account that this guy didn't have a chance really to change anything by the time he came to power. But because he's more conservative, he immediately created a cabinet where there are people that are from the right wing, really. Peronist, but right-wing Peronist. So the way that he handled COVID was very good in the sense that they immediately closed down the country. They closed down the economy 100%, something that didn't happen here. I think there were 30 people dead when they closed down the economy.
Wow.
So that's a huge change, right? But he also increased brutally the repression on the streets.
Oh, wow.
And he got outside of the jails lots and lots of prisoners. Lots of people who were in jail were just, taken out of jail. But there's nothing else in place.
Just released onto the streets.
Claro.
So if they don't have families to take care of them, then that's very...
Whatever was happening for them before, it's still happening now.
Right.
So now crime has increased exponentially in poor neighborhoods, because the wealthy neighborhoods are well protected, but the poor neighborhoods are not. So the situation is quite critical now, also because there's a lot of what we call happy trigger police. They were in power during the pandemic. I've seen videos of indigenous people running away from the National Guard with long guns shooting at them. There's like human chase on the streets, and there's already been a guy who has been disappeared by the police.
Oh, wow.
It's been 70 days and we've seen pictures of him with the police. He broke the pandemic because that's the deal. You cannot move. It's not like in the US that you get into your car and you go wherever you want. And then they tell you, stay 2 days at home, don't get in contact with anybody. Here's the police on the streets that stops you if you're trying to walk from one neighborhood to the other, or even outside of your house. At the beginning, not even the children could go outside. Now they have a couple of hours that children can walk outside.
Which does have precedent. I mean, there's other countries that also had that kind of a strict lockdown, like Spain and China, where I mean, it's not like the only. I guess it wouldn't have been necessarily like people there are thinking this is the only country this kind of thing is happening in, but that's so restrictive.
It's very restricted, but it's a country that doesn't have the resources of the United States. So if they allow people to just happily go to parties and whatever people are doing right now here, it will escalate and be out of control very, very quickly. I think we have over, what was it, 150,000 people died here in the United States, and nobody's talking much about it. We've naturalized what's happening here. You just stay home and you hope that you won't get infected, and your children, if you have children at home, and that's the end of it.
It's only the rest of the world talking about it here, which is, and here it's, I mean, it's, and the rest of the world, the U.S. is a daily headline. 150,000 dead is the daily headline, you know.
And we cannot go anywhere. Nobody will receive us right now because we are seen as COVID-19 dead walkers.
Yeah, yeah. What was the there was something I was seeing on a news story about people occupying land in Argentina, and I don't know how widespread this phenomenon is going on with people who are basically totally disenfranchised and unemployed and hungry, and they're occupying land and setting up soup kitchen there. I don't know if this is it was a story on Al Jazeera. I don't know if it's
it's the occupation of land has been ongoing for a long time, and it has ups and downs according to who's in power and how much people are allowed to do. Right now, I wasn't aware that there were occupations during COVID-19, but I might have missed the story. But occupation is a very common way of struggle in Latin America, because once you're in there, let's say that you take over a house that's been abandoned for a while. It's never done randomly. It's always social movements who are behind these takeovers, and they research what's going on with that property before they go in. So once you find people living in there that were never tenants, so they never had, a contract or anything, it's almost impossible to evict them. So if the government is going to evict them or the police is going to evict them, there's a huge political price to pay for it. And the movement is ready, to make sure that everybody finds out what happens. So it's very common that people will move in during the night. Hundreds of people will move in during the night. And when the police wakes up, it's all set up already. And there's families with children and they're cooking food, and they set up cleanup crews, and they show everybody that, this was a dumpster. We are taking out the rats now. Your neighborhood is going to be better now, etc. So it's a very common thing.
It was with the land occupations and the takeovers of the factories that was going on around 2001. It just seemed like a really hopeful moment, and where there was real sort of a way that was being pointed forwards, that was a really a new way forward, not the neoliberal model, but actually collectively run workplaces that were successfully able to make products and sell them and all that kind of stuff, like the Brookman factory. And I wondered what happened with that movement of factory takeovers in Argentina. Where did that?
They're still operating. All of the factories, I think all of them, if not all, 99% of them are still operating. And there's approximately 13,000 people making a living in those factories that were considered unviable economically in the year 2000, right? And now 20 years later, workers still have a salary and they control their factories. And there have been more occupations. That movement never stopped. It lost impetus. It wasn't such a huge thing as when unemployment was so high. But whenever a factory is about to close down, workers immediately move to try and occupy it. And some of them were successful. It all depends also who's in power, because the Kirchners never supported that movement, but they didn't move against it either. They sort of ignore it. They let it happen, sotto voce, as we say, quietly. But Macri was very much against allowing any of that. So the occupations were more flashy at that point. This new government...
flashy, like in terms of flashbang grenades? That kind of flash?
That kind of flash, yeah. The flash that you see from a distance, yeah.
Yeah.
But this new government tried to, there was a big factory that received tons of support from the state, and they fraudulently bankrupted it a few months ago. And the government's first move was to expropriate it and have the workers control it, as Chavez did in Venezuela. But as I said, he's very timid, and immediately there was backlash from the right wing, and he went backwards and he didn't do it. So now they're going to get to go home with all the money they stole from the state and just close the factory down. Mm. But no, the ones that were able to organize are still operating, and I think it's super important for people to know that, because it's mostly a matter of profit. The reason why factories close down, it's not a matter of it being non-viable economically. It's the people who invested money there that can take that money and invest it somewhere where they get more money. It's right. Similar to what happens with landlords and homes, right? It's not like the landlord gives you home. The landlord takes homes away from you because they buy property that, a regular person could buy with a regular salary, but you're not able to because they go in there first to make some profit. So what happens with the factories in many ways is similar to that. The factory doesn't give you work. The owner of the factory doesn't give you work. You work at the factory, and you are the one producing what's the value that is being sold in the market. So if you get rid of the owner of the factory, if you get rid even of management, these factories had no managers. I think only one manager remained. I met her. She was a woman. But whenever the leadership left, the managers would leave with them. And this is supposedly something so difficult to do. We go to school for how many years? These are the people who are best paid at any factory, and they were replaced in a matter of seconds by the workers. I'll always remember one of them at the Brooklyn factory, a woman who was making garments. She said, "I don't understand what the deal is. You got to add and subtract. That's all that happens here."
Right. Don't even need to know about division. When in 2019, there were rebellions happening in many different countries at the same time, really, really large scale. I mean, like in Chile, massive numbers of people in the streets, in Lebanon and Algeria and the Sudan. I guess they weren't all necessarily for the same reasons, but a lot of it seemed to be related to the rejection of the neoliberal project, as we might say, but particularly in Chile. But it wasn't a large scale uprising going on in Argentina at the time, though, or what was going on?
Well, Argentina, once in 2001, when we saw all the fireworks, was the time where the Peronists were in crisis and they couldn't control the working class and the unemployed. Since then, all the years of the Kirchner government were basically a huge effort of this more progressive ruling classes to discipline the social movements and conduct them towards the elections rather than 2001 insurrection style. And this is something they'll say explicitly. Because in their view, 2001 did a lot of harm to the country. In my view, nothing that happened afterwards would have happened without 2001.
Right.
It was the burning of the banks. It was the burning of the McDonald's, the defeating the police on the streets, the taking over of buildings, all of that allowed the space for Kirchner then to come and co-opt that movement and move things economically so that the country would recover. It was that movement that allowed Kirchner to break up with the IMF. It wasn't the politics, the everyday politics of Congress that allowed him to do that. And Kirchner knew that he had all these people behind him, that if the IMF, made things difficult, they could burn the country down, and they would have burned it down in a second. It was just a matter of him saying so. So that worked very well for the Kirchners. And while the economy was strong, it was great to have a social movement that was disciplined and would just march and protest whenever the Kirchners told them it was necessary. But once you demobilize a movement, you don't get a movement back again. So the way they had to get rid of Macri was through elections. There was hardly any mobilizations, although things happened that were really serious, like the disappearance of a guy by the National Guard in the South when they were protesting, indigenous people were protesting, they disappeared this guy. And there was a huge mobilization at that point, and the Kirchner said, cool it down, because the elections are on Sunday.
Mm.
So you're not going to have a huge mobilization when the Peronists are in power and in control. So Chile has the fortune of not having a Peronist movement. So when you have the neoliberals in power, you have lots of social movements from the bottom that are not co-opted, are not disciplined by a bigger, more liberal, if you want, or populist. I shouldn't say liberal, populist government. Things happen. So Chile, I think, it's a very clear example of what happens when you don't have a big populist movement.
Mm-hmm. And then you end up with a really, really big populist movement, I guess, in another sense, except
but
actually populist.
The problem that they had in Chile is the same problem that we had in Argentina, and the same problem we have in the United States. We haven't been able to find a place or a form of organizing that supersedes the constraints and the demobilization that the Leninist parties do, and at the same time allows us to have some sort of structure that once the wave of protest diminishes, because that always happens, it might last a month or 2 or 3, but at some point it's going to stop. Then what happens there? In Argentina, we weren't able to create those structures that would allow us to have an independent movement from the state that would keep on moving after Kirchner was in power. People either demobilized or went for the Kirchners or went for the Trotskys. The Trotskys are huge in Argentina. Right now, a little smaller, but a few years ago, they had 1 million votes, and they have national representatives in Congress. So that's the way the movement sort of like opened up once we were not able, the autonomies were not able to create some kind of structure that would help us move forward.
How big a part of the Congress in Argentina are Trotskyist parties?
Small. They only have 1 or 2 representatives, but it's impressive to see a Trotskyist in that situation. We are impressed with AOC here. Imagine if AOC were a Trotsky, the things that they say. I don't think I would vote for them for the presidential candidate, because I don't agree with the dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't agree with the structure of the party any longer, but I would always vote for them to be in Congress, because they are the only ones that would denounce the economic stuff that is going on. Nobody else says that kind of stuff. And also they are the ones that keep the trigger happy police in place. So I really want them to have that voice, amplified voice in Congress.
In terms of what's been going on in the United States, all over the country over the past couple of months since the killing of George Floyd, and the powers that be are of very different minds about how to deal with the whole situation, it seems. And of course, like when you describe the way that different governments dealt with the movements in Argentina, it reminds me of how many of the more progressive politicians are trying to get their police forces to kind of lay low and let the marches happen, while the other elements, like in the federal government, are just like send in all the tear gas we can find and make sure that this gets to be as big a conflagration as possible. Things aren't boring anymore here in the U.S.
I haven't been able to get out to the protest because I'm part of the group of people that need to be extremely careful with the COVID-19. So I've been very frustratingly following everything through the news feeds, the Facebook feeds of different activists. My impression was that during the first week, that week of the end of May, I think it was, we saw the real deal on the streets. The very young kids, the working class kids, setting stuff on fire, breaking down things, really protesting capitalism. That's what I saw. I thought it went way beyond what normally we are told racism is in the United States. The statues, the buildings, the representational form of racism. These kids went for the real deal. They went for the economic that sustains racism. But what I saw also almost immediately, maybe this lasted a week, was I guess the ones that would occupy the space of the Kirchners in US politics, the DSA and others, telling kids to stop it, that this was not the way to do it, that people were uncomfortable with this, with this kind of violence. It's not violence. Destruction of property is not violence, and property is not possessions. I have possessions. The bank has properties. The factories are properties. So if you're going to destroy property because property is destroying your life, I'm okay with that. But the DSA and many others were not. So I think there was a huge effort from progressive movements to try and rein in these kids. And some of them pretty stupid and McCarthyist in a way.
Yeah.
They got, for example, the girlfriend of the guy that died at Wendy's in jail because they kept saying that it was a white woman who was a provocateur who started the fires. Well, yeah, she was a white woman. She was the girlfriend of this guy. So there was a huge effort on the side of liberals to present the protests as fringe moments of anger that should be, better channeled into other ways. So then almost immediately we start seeing the statues come down. I love to see a racist statue come down. I would make a party around it, but it's not the real deal. So there was also a ton of money from the NGOs. Bill Gates in particular put a ton of money to create all these 501c3s that also put a damper on everything that was happening. The Portland moms, love them. But they just created a 501c3 run by a white woman with no connection whatsoever with the Black community there. So I see it was very fast. It was very fast. In Argentina, it would have taken several months to quell this. Here, it was done in a week because there's so much power. Liberals have so much power and so much money. In Latin America, all of the stuff that you do, how do you fund it? It's very difficult to fund the demobilization of an insurrection. But there's still, it is. Yeah. But there's still a ton of money here that you can throw around and get people who are way, way moderate and who want to save capitalism, because this is basically what's happening here, right? They want to save capitalism, so they will invest a ton of money. So I think that for us to see again that level of radicalism is going to take a while, because there's been a huge move to dampen it.
But it was such a refreshing moment that you could see that the anger was coming from everywhere all at the same time, and so it was impossible for anybody to say really legitimately that these are outside agitators. I mean, they could say, okay, they didn't come from this particular neighborhood. Well, very few people actually live downtown. So if you're going to go down. If you're going to go destroy banks, then of course you're not destroying it in the neighborhood you live in. So technically, you came from another neighborhood, but they can't say you came in from Seattle.
It must have been the biggest mobilization in the history of humankind, because in every town there was an outside agitator. There were no local agitators anywhere.
Right, they all were from the outside. Quite something. But it seems like. It was here again, although this the sort of level of property destruction didn't continue in most cities in the country after that first initial few days. It seems like that has gotten that just those few days got a lot of conversation happening in a lot of circles that were not talking about institutional racism hardly at all until now. And now it's like a common talking point, although it seems like it keeps on running them into all kinds of problems when they start talking about it, because as soon as they start talking about what sort of undergirds institutional racism, then they keep on coming smack into capitalism, right? I mean, it's kind of impossible to avoid talking about racism without pretty soon talking about capitalism in this country. Yeah.
I think so, but I think there's going to be a huge effort. I think that's going to be the effort to try and separate it by liberals, and they are telling us that we need to vote for Joe Biden now and forget about everything that happened because it's going to be easier to work with him than with Trump. I don't know what to say to that. I'm not going to vote for Biden. I'm not interested in making things easier for capitalism to continue to grow here. And I think this is the move. I've told people, I put a poster on my Facebook wall. Anybody who tries to shame me into that, I'm going to block you. So don't even try. Because I'm tired of that. I've been called a child. When I didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton, they told me I had to grow up. See, I've been growing up for a while now, but I think liberals are very antsy to see things stay the way they are, but it's going to be increasingly difficult. And this, the fact that we had this kind of destruction of property during that week indicates that there's a huge thing happening here.
Right.
This was just, the tip of the iceberg. In the middle of the pandemic, with difficulties to move around, unemployed, et cetera, you still see this kind of organizing. And I think that's why the Democrats are so desperate now to get the $600 back into everybody's bank accounts.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's going to be even more interesting. I don't know how long it will take for the reaction to happen, but if they cut the benefits now, we'll see something for sure.
Yeah, it's just a question of when, but
when and how.
And then, of course, if the moratoriums on evictions that are in place in much of the country are lifted, and there's no more $600 a week, it's very unpredictable to know what might happen. But it's like it seems very clearly to be an very intersectional mass movement that's going on, but there's the debate around like how to pigeonhole it or keep it narrowly focused on some people's ideas of what it means when you say Black Lives Matter. Like this seems to be much of the debate now. And I don't know. It's there was somebody from a representative of the African Methodist Church in Seattle who was saying basically like if you're going to talk about Black Lives Mattering, then you need to talk about things like the cost of housing and why it's unaffordable for Black people to live anywhere anymore. But
because it's clearly connected with the high cases of COVID-19, the lack of good resources in Black people's neighborhoods. I was very encouraged when I saw the occupations happening. The CHOP in Seattle and the Occupy City Hall in New York, they weren't able to sustain it long term, but I think it's still up in the air that people are still trying to set up occupations. It's just that as I said, I think the money of the NGOs is making things a little more difficult right now. It's taking a lot of energy from some of the movements into other areas. But I think the occupations are a way to move the discourse forward, because it's not, you could say it's violent in the sense that, you're breaking the law and you're doing something that you were explicitly told not to do, and you're breaking a number of norms when you occupy a public space. But it doesn't have the aesthetics of breaking a bank or burning Wendy's. So I think that's like a good middle ground for people to continue to think about what to do next. So I hope that there will be more occupations happening in the next few weeks.
It seems
I
so important to hold public space like that and have a sort of a center for activism to be happening from a particular physical location. But it seems also pretty clear that the authorities are very well aware of how powerful that is. And like in Seattle and here in Portland, they find every possible excuse to clear parks that have people in them overnight, who are actually trying to set up some kind of occupied zone like that. And people just marching in the streets all over the country. It seems like one of the clear patterns that's happening all over the country is anytime people take the streets in the most basic act of civil disobedience of just marching in the streets, they're being violently attacked by riot cops. Which is not the case in many countries where when people march in the streets, the police escort the march and allow it to happen, and maybe there will be violent repression in other settings. But also it sounds like the Kirchners also, like, taking another example, like in Argentina, saw the value in allowing marches to happen without police attacking people for just taking an intersection.
Well, they were able to do that because they knew that in the long term they would control the situation. Nobody has that impression here. Clearly, Trump is unable to control the situation, and Biden is like a joke. So they need to stop this now on the tracks. Think about it. The mayor of Chicago called for the federal agents to come into her city. So we see here, what Gramsci used to say, that the ruling classes find themselves and hug each other when they reach the state. We are seeing that very clearly. Both the Democrats and the Republicans represent different kinds of different sectors of the economy and different sectors of the ruling classes. And it gets to a point that both of them feel really threatened by the people. So that's, I think, why the repression is so much higher here. There are studies of when repression works and when it doesn't. It's very difficult to determine because, for the most part, you have to see also the history of these movements. No, in Argentina, we come from a history where we had 30,000 people disappear by the military in the middle of the night. So whenever the police gets a little out of hand, there's like, I don't know, we have like antibodies against that. And you will see tons of people that you normally wouldn't see on the streets coming out because they're afraid that we are going to go back to those days. In the United States, the radical left was destroyed in the 1920s. And since then, we've seen, small things like Occupy Wall Street or the anti-corporate globalization movement that we used to be part of, and other things that happened, Black Lives Matter. But we don't still have that history of huge organizing and huge organizations that have succeeded throughout decades to protect people. So it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. If they increase the repression, will that make people angrier and go even with more determination out on the streets and occupy spaces? Or is it going to deter them and just go back home and destroy everything? It's difficult to tell at this point. But there's a role for repression, that's for sure.
It was interesting hearing Attorney General Barr talking about the Occupy model, because certainly during the Occupy Wall Street movement all over the U.S., it was a Democratic government in Washington, and the response to the occupations of different parks around the country varied a lot. But then after a while, the response was pretty uniformly police brutality.
Yeah. Even in Boston, where the mayor was supposedly such a progressive mayor, they were repressed. As soon as they tried to move into a bigger area, they were repressed, seriously repressed. And people complain, but not too much.
In Chicago, the repression was so bad that there was never an overnight presence for the Occupy movement.
Wow.
Never, people could stand on the sidewalk, but if they fell asleep in any kind of situation, then they get arrested. Do you have any? I know it's a terrible thing to ask people for predictions, but you've accurately predicted one election in the past.
That was very easy. I really don't know what's going to happen. I think I'm super interested in watching it, and I have to confess I'm watching it from outside. I don't feel that there's nothing. I'm not going. I don't know. The last time, this is not going to sound terribly good, but the only reason I voted in the last election when we were supposed to go vote for Hillary Clinton, I'm in an all blue state. This is Massachusetts. So I know everybody will do their liberal duty and go and vote for Biden. That's clear. So I can do the liberal duty, the duty of the radical, which is to show that I'm not happy. So I will not go to vote. Last time I did go to the voting polls because we were asked whether we thought that weed was a good thing to have normalized, and I wanted to vote to normalize weed.
Something
So
that
since
directly affects our
yeah,
lives,
yeah,
for
seriously
one.
affects our lives. Yeah. So I did that. But this time I don't think there's anything that big in the ballot. So I wonder. I don't know what's going to happen with this election. Somebody has to win the election. Elections are not lost. People don't lose elections. The impetus of power is going to get Trump reelected again, especially in this country where people don't want to change halfway. It's very common that they will vote again for the same candidate. Who was the one that they didn't vote for? The peanut guy. What was his name?
Right, Jimmy Carter. Yeah.
Jimmy Carter. He was one of the few that lost a second term, right?
Hmm.
So Biden is not a candidate that anybody's going to go out on the streets, and picket for him. So I don't know what's going to happen. I see that that Trump's numbers are going down, which should be the case, given that there's more than 100,000 people dead, and nobody seems to be very concerned about it. But at the same time, where's Biden?
Where's
Saying that we
Biden?
should. The only thing I've heard from Biden was that that police should shoot people on the legs
Yeah.
and not on the head, and that anarchists should be surveilled and taken to jail.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
Anarchists and arsonists, which is apparently the same thing. They both
Yeah,
start with an A. Yeah.
yeah. So what's going to happen with this election? I don't know. The Argentinian election was a given. Everybody knew that Macri was going to lose. I was confused. I thought that Macri would lose by a bit wider margin. So in this case, I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are. I mean, I guess it's true just pretty much anytime anybody is in power in this country, and maybe it's true all over the place, that there's always some people who are seeing the specter of fascism under every rock. But it's in this case, it seems like Trump is following a sort of a playbook, like not really doing it very competently, but it seems like every week I see some news headline that reminds me of like reading a book about Germany 1933, with all these acting heads and all these not paying attention to. I mean, it's not unique to Germany by any means, but like not paying attention to court rulings. Court tells them to do something, and then the executive branch just completely ignores and then he talks about not going by the results of the November election, not letting people vote.
I think that Trump is an authoritarian figure. I don't agree that it's that we are in the presence of fascism or anything close to what the Nazis had. Not because I think Trump is better than Hitler, but because it was a very different economic makeup that of fascism. There was over 20% unemployment, and they needed a scapegoat to explain why the economy was tanking. So they found that the communists and the Jews and the gypsies were the issue. But in order to control the state the way they did it, they socialized a number of things that we don't have here. You were in the hands of the state. The state gave you medicine. The state guaranteed you an income, etc., etc., etc. We don't see any of that. In a way, we hope we had that kind of stuff. The only thing we have is the authoritarian bent of the government, but there's nothing in the makeup of this country that tends towards fascism, the way that fascism is understood, which is the government controls the unions, the government controls the corporations. We have corporations controlling the government. This is a completely different deal. So whatever is going to happen here, we shouldn't look at Germany for illumination. It's not going to help us understand neither our responses as social movements, nor what we might expect from the state is going to follow whatever happened in Germany or any other country that had fascism, because the economy is not controlled by the state in this case at all.
I guess people with an interest in history are always trying to find connections to try to understand the current moment through that lens. But if you are looking at are you reminded of any particular past episodes in the history of any particular country when you look at what's happening around us now? Or is it just...
It's a banana republic.
Right.
If you want to find examples, look for examples under, I don't know what Duvalier was doing, people like that. He's like Trump is more like a third, using old terminology, a third world dictator than a fascist. A fascist is a big thing. A fascist is somebody who can control the economy, control the government, control the war, a number of things. This guy has nothing of that. And it's almost a fluke that he came into power, because the neoliberal power was behind Hillary Clinton. This guy didn't even have a real economic plan ahead of him. It was just more like a publicity stunt that he orchestrated. If you think about it, none of his economic policies have come to pass. None of them. The jobs back, where are the jobs back? Where did he reopen the coal plants? I think he opened half a coal plant. What was he able to do? None of that, because that was just not something that could be done under neoliberalism. You would need an occupy of the whole country to be able to do the plan that he was saying he was going to do. So I don't know.
Here in Oregon, which of course has been run by Democrats like Massachusetts for many, many decades, the employment department is so incompetent that the gig economy workers, most gig economy workers, which is I think 1/4 of the unemployed here, have not actually received a single check.
Oh, wow.
It's been 4 months now.
Wow.
And they had on Oregon Public Broadcasting, they had there was an Iraqi American taxi driver saying the same thing. Basically, this is a banana republic. How can I be?
Yeah.
I've been applying for these for this money they say I qualify for 4 months, and I don't get a single response at any point.
Amazing.
It's really it really feels like a society at a real breaking point, because this is not it's not just the marginalized people with drug and alcohol issues, or at least who can be sort of looked at through that lens by the middle classes. Like, it's not just a certain little sector of society that is forced to live in cars and tents. It's now just the average person who's looking at that kind of
so
situation.
we will see changes, because I think that's when change starts happening, when poverty starts eating up at the middle class, right? I've seen changes already. I teach at a big university, and I teach big lecture classes. In 2005, when I was teaching as a TA at UMass, I couldn't talk about capitalism critique. I could, but I would get a lot of flack. I can teach amazing things nowadays, and some students will react. But after 2008, the change was huge.
Really, that was the mark. Huh?
That was a mark, yeah. Well, I've had students whose parents were vice president of banks who are now on Pell Grants at UMass.
Wow. Yeah, because the bank collapsed, or that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the vice president couldn't find a job. And once the kid turned 24, well, he was on a Pell Grant.
And then they've got to go into the housing market and try to rent a place that's owned by a bank that's now charging twice as much rent as 10 years ago, which is a fascinating other aspect to the whole.
So I think in 5 years, we'll see a huge change. If we don't see it faster, from now till 5 years, there's going to be some huge change here, unless something changes in the economy and in the politics, which I don't see big trends that are going to make that change.
Any predictions on what kind of form that movement will take over the next 5 years? I had to ask.
I hope it's an Occupy.
Yeah, me too. Graciela, thank you so much for joining me for the hour. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. See you around, I hope.
Ciao.
Ciao. And thanks everybody for tuning into this conversation with Dr. Graciela Monteagudo at the University of Massachusetts. You can find all of these discussions archived in various places, including on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics in the Discussions with David playlist. You'll also find them all in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform, or just go to davidrovics.com. If you want to support my broadcasting efforts, you're most welcome to become a patron at patreon.com/davidrovics, where all these broadcasts are also available for anyone to download, along with some patron-only offerings as well. If you're in the Portland area, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up to receive text notifications so you can be part of Portland emergency eviction response when the investment banks that own half of this city start trying to evict so many of our neighbors. If you want to help make my next album a multi-instrumental success, check out davidrovics.com/pandemic sessions. Remember, don't pay the rent. Don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.